This time it's 5 contemporary classics. This time looking at 5 Japanese motorcycles which are even now regarded as classics, or will almost certainly be regarded as classics in years to come. Kawasaki ZZR series essentially comprised of 2 different models. There was the 1100cc version and the 600, with the 1100 version, known as the ZX-11 in the US, being introduced in 1989, and was an updated and more accomplished version of the earlier ZX-10. Early road tests indicated that top speed was somewhere between 169 and 170 miles an hour. That's 272 or 283 kilometers an hour, making it the fastest production bike in the world at that time. The smaller 600 was equally impressive. Its 59cc 4-cylinder engine produced a claimed 99 horsepower for a top speed of just over 150 miles an hour, making it the first machine in the 600 class genuinely capable of topping 150. Both these machines were built in an era before superbikes or sports bikes were styled as race replicas, with both the 1100 and the 600 being designed as sports tourers. And to that end, both machines were large and very comfortable, and their big fairings really gave good protection at higher speeds. And although generally capable handlers, with their soft suspension these were not track weapons. And to that end in 1995, bowing to fashion, Kawasaki would introduce the ZX6, a more race replica orientated 600. Although the ZZR 600 would continue alongside it, remaining in Kawasaki's range through until 2008, outliving its larger sibling by 7 years. Suzuki's GSX-R range arrived in 1984, although it actually arrived as the 400cc first, with the 750 following in 1985 and the mighty 1100 in 1986. Replacing the earlier Katana models, they represented a huge change in thinking for Suzuki. The earlier slab sides are perhaps the most iconic, and these featured air oil-cooled engines of 4 cylinders and 4 valves per cylinder of 750, placed in an aluminium perimeter frame, surrounded by that truly iconic bodywork. The machines are also impressively light by the standards of the time, with the 750 weighing in at 435 pounds and the 1100 480 pounds, or 207 and around 219 kilos respectively. Of the two, the 1100 was certainly the hooligan tool. With around 130 horsepower stock, the machine was very much a traditional muscle bike and really outperformed its chassis and suspension, making it a very hairy ride indeed if you pushed it. The 750 was a more balanced machine and was very much a racer with lights. Its nearest competitors being the VFR 750 from Honda and Yamaha's 5-valve per cylinder FZ750. But these in truth were very different machines, being far more complicated than the Suzuki and a fair bit heavier too. On track, Honda's complex VFR was difficult to beat, but the simpler and lighter Suzuki was very much the privateer's choice. 1988 would see a major update with completely new styling and a new frame too, along with a completely revised intake system featuring these slingshot carburetors. The engine now boasted more power, but was essentially the same air oil-cooled mill. In 1991, the engine was given minor cosmetic changes, which include the enclosure of those twin headlamps. These changes meant that the second generation bike was now more aerodynamic and featured a more rigid chassis. On the demerit side, overall weight had crept up a little. The third generation of the iconic wraparound frame Gixxers arrived in 1992 and was the first to feature a water-cooled engine, with the new engine boasting a claimed 118 horsepower, while overall weight had remained unchanged from the previous model. The final fourth generation arrived in 1994 and did feature some changes to the chassis and engine which dropped the overall weight of the machine by 10 kilos. But by that time the Gixxer was outdated and was replaced by a completely new machine in 1996. It's often said that after visiting the TT and witnessing the AJS V4 being demonstrated, Sakura Honda was inspired to develop his own range of V4 superbikes. Whatever the truth of this, Honda did introduce their V4s in 1983. These range from 400 to 1000 cc's. But the first generation of VFs would suffer a range of problems, often in the larger capacity bikes it must be said, around the top end of the engine. Poor oil supply to the camshafts, which wore very quickly, and rapid wear cam chains. Plus the bike was rather heavy and fitted with a rather small front wheel, and don't even mention those inboard disc brakes. All this did very little for Honda's prestige, or reputation for reliability. Honda moved quickly, and in just 3 years, in 1986, Honda brought the replacement to market. There was a completely new chassis with conventional brakes, but the engine was the most improved. The lubrication system was much improved to the top end, and there was now gear-driven cams, so there was no more worries about cam chain problems. Well, for the VFR at least. And to cap it all, not only was the machine much more reliable, it was now much more nimble, more powerful, and much lighter too. Right from the early road test, the bike was described as a modern classic. So much more advanced was it than the previous model. And the chassis and that characterful engine offered something that was totally unique in the market at that time. The machine was initially very successful as a superbike racer, and there was a race replica V4, but this was only available as a 400. Later there would be the RC30 and RC45s, but these were very different machines built for homologation reasons, and were very different from the standard VFR, sharing virtually no components, and even their engines would feature a different firing order. And as the 80s wore on, the standard VFR would be increasingly fashioned as a sports tourer, something at which the machine was incredibly adept, becoming the standard by which all other sports tourers were judged during the period. For much of its run, the VFR received only minor styling updates. This changed over in 1994 with the introduction of the RC36-2. This featured styling which was very much influenced by the oval-pistoned NR750, something which likely really annoyed the people who'd spent a fortune buying an NR750. 1998 would see the 750 replaced by an all-new 800 model, and despite pressure, Honda never did release a more sporty version of the VFR. So if you really want a sporty V4, it's going to have to be an RC45 or an RC30, and you better dig deep. Yamaha's sporty FZ series was of course the precursor for the modern day R1 and R6 series bikes, and the FZR, which was for many years the top dog amongst superbikes, is a machine which is strangely forgotten today. But for a number of years these were the sports bikes to have. The 600 was not the most powerful in class, and was less powerful than the CBR 600 for example, but was generally a more sporty offering and more nimble. Comments which would apply equally to the 400cc version too. The FZR 1000 however was very different. It featured a 5-valve cylinder head, derived from that used on the earlier FZ750, but the chassis of the 1000 was very different and was a generation or two ahead of that of the 750, despite coming to market just 2 years after its smaller sibling. The all-aluminium Delta Box chassis was genuinely a development of their Grand Prix machines, and that 989cc engine was inclined at 45 degrees just like that of the 750, and offered class-leading performance. However, as effective as the first generation machine was, Yamaha did not rest on their laurels, and in 1989 the old twin headlamp model was replaced by an all-new model, which featured totally revised styling, including a very trendy letterbox style headlamp, but more importantly the engine was now enlarged to 1002cc and was a thorough redesign, with the engine block now angled at 35 degrees, and was now fitted with the X-Up power valve system, which incorporated thinking first employed in two-stroke engines, which essentially modulated the size of the exhaust port, giving the engine tremendous flexibility, but also allowing the use of high-raised cams, raising power still further to near the 140 horsepower mark. And so effective was the system that it was applied to the later Thunder Race and even early versions of the YZF-R1. 1994 would see the final version of the X-Up, now featuring twin fox eye headlamps in line with those used on the 600. Today many people will describe the Fireblade as a groundbreaking machine for its lightweight and performance. But in fact later versions of the X-Up weighed in at just 209 kilos or 461 pounds. That's just 2 kilos heavier than the GSX-R 750. But the fact is the FZR was long in the tooth by the 1990s, and 1996 would be its final year of production, with its spiritual successor the YZF-R1, a machine which used the same engine, just 2 years away. Suzuki's SV650 arrived in 1999 and was, like the larger TL1000, a major departure for Suzuki at this time, who had had considerable success with the Bandit models, which used essentially old GSX-R engines in a new steel frame. But the SV was very different from the Bandit, featuring as it did a 645cc liquid-cooled 8-valve direct overhead cam 90-degree V-twin engine, which Suzuki claimed produced around 70 horsepower. The machine was available in its initial form as an S model with a half fairing and a standard naked model. The naked model was quite the wheelie demon, courtesy of that torquey engine and lightweight. The S model was surprisingly sporty, and was clearly influenced by Ducati's SS models, while the naked model owed much to the Ducati Monster. But the engine was very Japanese in one sense. It doesn't quite have the character of a Ducati, say, but it is very characterable by Japanese standards. It is very refined and has a very smooth torque curve, making these machines a lot more user-friendly than the equivalent Ducati, although overall performance is perhaps a little mild when you consider the fact that it's liquid-cooled and 4-valved. A cheap version of a 748 it most certainly isn't, but for all that the bike is user-friendly. Although the gearbox can get rather notchy with age, the engine generally has an indestructible reputation. Although this is a Suzuki, so electrical equipment can give trouble, especially alternators, and general build quality is a little bit behind Honda, say. So items such as fastenings and paintwork are much more prone to corrosion. But there are an awful lot of SVs out there. It's been a very popular bike and remains in production somewhat amazingly after 25 years. And its motor has even found its way into Suzuki's popular adventure bikes. But there's no doubt the SV makes a fantastic first bike. These bikes are cheap, generally reliable and plentiful, and above all the V-twin has a character all of its own, even if the standard exhaust is a little bit quiet. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us cover in a future video? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.